And just a quick word about David. He's with SL Ross Environmental, and he's been researching oil and chemical spill cleanup since 1990. And his fun fact, I always ask my guest speakers for one personal fun fact about themselves, just to kind of, you know, make them more relatable to our audiences. 2020 is going to be the year that he's going to learn how to surf.
I've been trying for 10 years. Every time something happens,
That's the laser.
COVID-19 seems to be the issue this time around. We'll see. Thank you very much for that introduction. Hello, everyone. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about this presentation that's been assembled entitled Testing of Chemical Herders and Evaluation of Performance. Now, the overall arc of the story that I'm setting here is I want to talk about the development of our herder testing protocol that we've been involved with over the last, well, it's been going on for quite a while now, but on a more official basis for the last 5 to 7 years. And this has basically been the culmination of a lot of research that we've been involved in and some other people have been involved in, looking at a bunch of bench scale and larger scale testing where the protocol has been tweaked over time. And I just wanted to take you through some of the history of it, and then may provide some additional background information on exactly what herders do, the thought process on their use, and how they are currently evaluated. So in developing this herder testing protocol, we wanted to answer 3 primary questions. First of all, how they're used, what criteria would be most important as far as their behaviors, and exactly how do we evaluate performance. How are herders used? Well, there's 3 basic means that herders are currently used. First and foremost is as a means of controlling slick. Secondly is to improve performance of other more traditional techniques. And finally, as a precursor to in-situ burning, which currently seems to be the primary focus of a lot of work. The first area here, herders as a means of controlling a slick. A small project was started up around a little over a decade ago, actually, looking at using herders, which had been researched prior to it. But the idea this time around was to try to clear a simulated spill from a salt marsh. The thought process was if you could have a means of eliminating or moving the oil away from plants, etc., and have another method of collecting or cleaning the oil once the oil has been moved away from the plants, that would eliminate the need to get in with heavier equipment that might cause a lot more damage than simple natural attenuation. So we wanted to improve on natural attenuation. And that was the genesis of the small study. So the study consisted of just small trays with plants in them, a variety of conditions, different salinities, different herders, a couple of different temperatures. We wanted just to see what would happen. So the results, well, none of the testing resulted in the oil being completely cleared from the simulated marsh, which wasn't great. However, the slick areas were greatly reduced. Some of the tests saw quite a significant reduction. In reducing the area of coverage, the oil layers themselves thickened up quite a bit, and we saw thicknesses greater than 3 millimeters. I'm mentioning the 3 millimeters because that'll be brought up again a little later in the presentation. Another point about this study is that there still was a residue of rings of oils remaining around the original oil stocks, but because the bulk of the oil was able to be moved, it was felt that this was a good starting point and it would rapidly age natural attenuation in these sensitive areas. The other Second area I wanted to talk about with how herders are used are to improve performance of other traditional techniques. Historically, herders were also considered as a means of trying to clear oil from around ice where you may not be able to get conventional containment booms, etc., in and around to control the oil during skimming operations, etc. Movement around ice can be problematic with larger pieces of equipment for obvious logistical reasons. So this series of tests that was performed over the past decade at the OMSET facility incorporated 2 skimmers. And these were 2 different types of skimmers, the first being a weir skimmer, second being a disc skimmer. Now, for those who may not be familiar with the nuances of these 2 skimmers, weir skimmer is a simple device, operates on a weir system whereby oil is allowed to flow into a hopper where a pump resides, and the oil is pumped and moved to temporary storage. The issue with weir skimmers is the sensitivity and control to try to limit the amount of water that you're picking up at the same time. You're trying to maintain the weir at the oil-water interface, how the oil is floating on the water. It can get a little tricky to operate. Disc skimmers, on the other hand, rely on oil adhering to its surface, a rotating disc going through the water-oil interface. Oil sticks to the material, gets scraped off of the scraper, drops down again into a hopper arrangement where it can be pumped away. So we looked at the performance first here of the weir skimmer, and I was told there was a laser beam in front, right, built in. The graphic here shows the front row, shows the performance without any herder. So you've got a weir skimmer operating in an oil layer, and it's picking up very low. During testing, it's a ½ gallon per minute, which was not impressive. The numbers that are superimposed on the graphic are actually the thickness of the oil layer that it's operating in. So the skimmer performance is on the y-axis, and the actual thickness of the oils is listed on the graphic itself. When we were applying a herder and the oil was herded to a specific area, and the weir skimmer was used, performance increased greatly. We got much better results, up to approximately 7 times better performance here on this first run anyway, just to give you an idea. And as you can see from the elevations generally of the bars in the background, performance was vastly improved for this particular technology. So we count that as a win for the weir skimmers. How do things look for the disc skimmer? Well, performance wasn't really affected at all. Again, the performance actually went down on the first run, which there's going to be variability in the measurements that are taken. So that's not a huge shocker. Even if it went up a little bit, we call that even. But for this particular technology area, we found that the performance under the conditions that we were testing weren't greatly improved. Some thought went into this afterwards, and one idea here was that the skimmer may have been limited in its performance due to attempting to operate in the exact same mode. When you do have a thicker layer of oil, you might be able to get away with rotating the discs a little faster. Your pickup rate will increase at that point. You run the risk of maybe picking up a little bit more water at the same time, and it all becomes a bit of a balancing act. But generally speaking, the weir skimmers are able to be boosted in performance much better than the disc skimmer for this series of tests.
The values on the arrow,
yeah,
they don't seem to correspond with the axis. Like you see that 2.5.
Yes. That again, the 2.5 that's on the back, that is the actual slick thickness measurement
Oh, I see.
that the skimmer was operating in. And I apologize, this is an old graphic and it's a bit confusing. If I were to redo it, I would do it differently. So the heights of the bars, you want to be, the heights of the bars is what you want to be comparing. For all intents and purposes, ignore the numbers that are written in there.
Could it also be that the rear skimmers are less efficient than a disc skimmer, because if you're wanting to increase the capacity of the rear, the thicker the oil, the higher efficiency it's going to have, because you're pulling in more oil.
Right.
Thin layer.
It's
Whereas a disc skimmer, you're just, the disc can only turn so fast. So if you had maybe another type of skimmer, say a brush, speed level, you probably get a higher rate.
True. And it also comes back to the experience and the expertise of the operator too, because simply running a skimmer faster won't necessarily either increase your oil pickup or improve performance, because you really increase the risk of picking up water. And in a lot of instances, when the machine is operating, it becomes difficult to visualize, to see if you're slowly increasing, if you are picking up more water. Sometimes because of the oil coating, you don't really see the water that clearly.
You only got some surface area.
True.
So just a note for folks in the room and our speakers that are coming up, we have about 40 people that are online listening to this. So just so you know, when you turn your back to this little microphone that's on the corner right there, the folks online are fussing at me and they're saying they can't hear. And if there are questions from the audience, we'd ask that any of the speakers maybe briefly summarize what the question was, because the folks online can't hear what the audience is saying. Okay. So thank you so much. Just moving forward, please.
The third area I wanted to talk about was the use of herders as a precursor to in-situ burning. Herders are typically used to thicken an oil slick to a thickness greater than 3 millimeters, so it can be ignited. And 3 millimeters is kind of a rule of thumb that gets bounced around, primarily for the ability to create a sustained burn. As an oil slick is burning, it's consuming the oil, and the oil layer thickness is diminishing. For the first period of time, the burn can happily continue on, because the oil that's underneath the flame is acting as an insulator from the water body. As the thickness of the oil diminishes, that insulation layer diminishes, and you start getting a lot of heat rejection down to the water below it. And the heat rejection starts to cool the overall oil slick. As the layer gets thinner and thinner, heat rejection to the water increases to the point where it starts to adversely affect the generation of vapors, and the flames will self-extinguish. So as a general rule of thumb, we use 3 millimeters as a minimum starting point in order to achieve a reasonable ignition. And one of the pluses that we really wanted to look at here was to try to highlight and determine performance characteristics around the ability to propagate in-situ burning without the need for extra containment equipment. In-situ burning using traditional equipment of fire booms, etc., does require a fair amount of ancillary tools, logistically to mobilize, etc. It becomes a process that requires a fair amount of planning to perform in a safe and efficient manner. So we were also investigating in-situ burning as a means of perhaps minimizing the amount of equipment that would be needed to start in-situ burning in a variety of locations under a variety of conditions. So with respect to testing of the herders to make a determination of oil thickness, we ran some tests at a facility in Krell, looking at larger test cells that are about 18 and change feet by 18 and change feet. This is kind of a time lapse of around an hour and a half, where an oil layer was laid out into the test cell. Period of time was left for it to settle to make sure that it reached the extent of the cell. And then a very small quantity of the herder was applied around the perimeter, and it was let sit for a period of an hour just to see what would happen. And this was generally the format of the testing protocol that had been used up to this point. And as you can see from the video that we just showed, the effectiveness of the herder is quite apparent. We also did testing under cooler conditions, where we had slight ice infestation in the test cell. Gives a similar sort of performance, but you can see the oil is going to behave a little differently, given the obstruction of the ice particles, as well as the cooler temperature. Oils are going to be a little more viscous, etc. And this actually led to an important fact of operations that was flagged. When we were doing the testing, we had left the small syringe with the herder in the cooled chamber, and the herder cooled down with it. And we had a couple of test runs where that happened, and we got really weird results where performance was really below what we were expecting. And we had to stop our testing and try to figure out what was going on. And it turned out it was the herder itself wasn't operating properly because of the cold temperatures. We had some weird things happening. It was thickening up. It wasn't spreading out itself on the surface, so it wasn't interacting with the oil properly. And from that point on, we started the process where we were preheating the actual herder itself in the control room, which was just room temperature. And then we bring the syringe with us to actually run the test afterwards. So it started off the thought process that when we're testing herders in the future, look at a couple of different temperatures for performance of the oil in a herder, and make a determination if the herder is adversely affected by operating at a colder temperature. There we go. Now, as a precursor to in-situ burning, we were involved in a study that was performed off the coast of Norway back in 2016, where quantities of oil were released into the ocean, let drift for a period of about an hour, and then attempts were made to try to apply a herder on the perimeter of the bulk of the thicker portions of the slick to get it to herd and thicken up to a point where attempts were made to ignite the oil after that to see what would happen. The first picture just shows the application of one edge of where we were targeting, and that's basically applying a herder just with a single point nozzle from a small operating boat. And the second picture shows two of the operating boats as the application of herder was going on. It's kind of hard to see within the slide, but there's a gap in space here, and that's where one of the craft has gone by and applied the herder. The oil has moved away from where the herder is. It's contracted in the middle. So we're thickening up there. And here's a shot of the ignition attempt following that. The two small operating boats still in the same area. This image is being taken from a UAV. And here's another shot of the burns happening, and you can see the flames at the edge there. There's no mechanical traditional containment. It's just herders followed by ignition with it was a ad hoc handheld igniter device that we'd come up with.
was the water temperature there?
I want to say about 3. We were told if you fall in, get out quickly. Because it was less than a minute where your body would start clamping down.
In the sea state.
Surprisingly calm. I was a little shocked, actually. The question was, how was the sea state? It was surprisingly calm. I was expecting conditions to be a lot worse. We had a window of opportunity of a number of days where we had to get the testing done. And this was a shockingly smooth beginning where on day 1, we had a window of opportunity to actually do a burn, and we went for it. And we actually, well, we had a day and we tried to fill it with as much as we could. And we ended up getting 3 burns done, I believe, on the first day. And it ended up being a pretty good test because of that. Now, all this is fed into the actual testing protocol, where questions that have been arisen from the different projects have kind of come up with a point where we have asked the question, what do we want to test? And the 3 points are, will the herder affect the oil when applied around the perimeter of the slick? How thick will the slick end up? And how long will the herder impact the slick? This is just a quick video showing our current protocol, and it relies on the application of 500 mils or half a liter of oil into a 1 meter by 1 meter test tray. You wait for an hour for the oil to relax and go to its extents. Apply a very small quantity of herder around the perimeter, and then let it react for a period of an hour. And during that time, you're measuring the thickness of the oil layer. We do it visually, looking at the surface area coverage of the oil, making the assumption that the thickness of the oil is going to be fairly consistent. We know what volume of oil we started with, we know the area, we did the calculation to get the thickness. Other people have come up with sensors to actually directly measure the thickness. You've got to make sure your sensor is exactly in the right spot, or have many, many sensors around and average out your readings. So again, this is just another oil, another test. In 2 hours, I'll never get back. In any event, I'll move on. I'm getting flags here that I'm talking way too much again. Okay, so kind of summary here with respect to the herder testing protocol. The way it's gelled down right now is we look at, we apply the oil and wait for an hour for it to extend. Apply the herder at a low dose around the perimeter, and wait another hour and monitor over periods of time. The area of the slick is measured, and we use that to calculate the thickness. And as I said, there are some other methods that are coming online to directly make that measurement. We want to determine the starting slick thickness, maximum slick thickness, and the slick thickness after 1 hour of herder application, because it's kind of become a rule of thumb that the herders start losing effectiveness after about an hour's time, where the interface between the herder and the oil starts to migrate into one another, and the slick starts to relax a little bit. So the herder testing protocol, why are we doing it? Well, so that comparisons of the herders themselves can be made. Impacts on oil herder interactions can be made, because some oils will react with some herders in different ways. Different herders will give a slightly different result with the same oil. It's not a one oil, it's not a one herder is best in all situations. There really is different scenarios where one herder might work a little better than another. And as well, in going through the testing, we can define a window of opportunity and identify at what point the herder starts to lose its effectiveness. And that'll help operators know if they're going to use herders to try to contain an oil, with the idea that it's a precursor to in-situ burning, the clock starts ticking from that point as to when they should have started laying down ignition sources to get the oil lit. And that's, thank you.